They found it at 2,500 meters below the surface of the Indian Ocean, and the moment the ROV cameras sent back the first image, the dive team went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from technical focus, the kind that comes from dread. The kind that means what you are looking at is worse than anything you imagined. For 67 years, no one knew exactly what happened to HMAS Sydney. Not officially. Not completely. The ship vanished on November 19, 1941, and took 645 men with it, every single soul on board. No survivors. No wreckage anyone could reach. No final transmission that explained the full horror of what unfolded in those dark waters off the Western Australian coast. The families of those men waited decades for answers that never came, and the Australian Navy, for all its resources, searched and came back empty. Until 2008, until the cameras rolled, until maritime experts stared at footage they were not prepared for. Here is the question that changes everything. How does one of the most powerful warships in the Royal Australian Navy, a ship that had already proven itself in battle, get destroyed in a single engagement by what appeared to be a Dutch cargo freighter? How does a vessel armed with 8 6-inch guns, capable of outrunning almost anything in the water at over 32 knots, get torn apart so catastrophically that it sinks with no survivors, no lifeboats launched, no distress signal received in time to matter? The answer was buried at the bottom of the ocean, and when they finally reached it, what they found did not just confirm the tragedy. It rewrote the final hour of 645 men. HMAS Sydney was no ordinary ship. Built in Great Britain, she stretched 562 feet of steel and firepower, a light cruiser engineered for speed and aggression. By November 1941, she was already a decorated vessel. Earlier that year, she had fought and won a major engagement in the Mediterranean, earning a reputation that bordered on legend within the Royal Australian Navy. She was not considered vulnerable. She was considered an asset, a symbol, a warship that had already looked danger in the eye and come home. On November 19, 1941, she was doing something routine by wartime standards. She was escorting a troop carrier back toward Australia, a mission considered relatively safe given her firepower and speed. There were 645 men aboard. Officers, engineers, gunners, and sailors who believed with reasonable confidence that they were on the right ship, the powerful one, the one that came back. What they encountered on the horizon changed everything. The vessel that appeared was the Kormoran, a German auxiliary cruiser operating under one of the most effective disguises of the entire Second World War. At 538 feet, the Kormoran was not dramatically smaller than Sydney. But on paper she looked nothing like a warship. She was sailing under the identity of the Straat Malika, a neutral Dutch freighter. Her disguise was meticulous. Her threat was invisible. Hidden within her hull were 6 5.9-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and more than 300 naval mines. Her commander, Captain Theodore Detmers, was not a man who fought fair. He fought smart. When Sydney spotted the vessel and moved in to identify it, the encounter began as a slow, watchful approach. What happened next has been reconstructed through German survivor accounts, because there were no Australian survivors to tell the story. As Sydney drew within approximately 1,000 yards, roughly 914 meters, Kormoran dropped the disguise. The Dutch flag came down. The guns came out. And in the moments that followed, a point-blank naval ambush began that neither Sydney nor her crew could recover from. That decision to approach so closely, a decision likely made by Captain Joseph Burnett, is the detail that maritime historians have examined with the sharpest eyes. A 1,000-yard engagement distance strips away the tactical advantage of a superior warship. At that range, the element of surprise, combined with concealed firepower, is catastrophic. Burnett had likely grown confident in Sydney's proven strength. That confidence, tragically, may have been the deciding factor. Kormoran opened fire with everything. 87 shells, 5.9-inch armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds hammered into Sydney in rapid succession. Torpedoes followed. The damage was immediate and devastating. Fires broke out across the ship, fed by aircraft fuel, engine stores, and ammunition. The structure that had survived the Mediterranean began to come apart under a sustained point-blank assault it had never been designed to absorb at that range, with no warning and no distance between itself and the guns that were now fully exposed and firing. Sydney returned fire. She damaged Kormoran severely enough that the German ship was eventually scuttled by her own crew. Detmers did not walk away from the engagement cleanly. But Sydney was already beyond saving. She drifted, burning, into the night. And then she was gone. For 67 years, those were the broad strokes, the outline, the story told by German survivors who were eventually captured and who gave accounts that, for decades, were the only first-hand testimony anyone had. The Australian side of the story existed only in the silence of 645 men who never came home. Then, David Mearns arrived. Mearns was a shipwreck hunter, the kind of figure who operates at the intersection of obsession, precision, and deep-sea technology. He didn't rely on hope or approximate coordinates. He used sonar mapping of the seabed, cross-referenced with German survivor accounts, triangulated position data, and years of research to narrow the search zone. In 2008, his team deployed equipment capable of sweeping the Indian Ocean floor at depths that would have been unreachable a generation earlier. And they found both ships, Sydney and Kormoran, lying 12 nautical miles apart on the ocean floor at depths between 2,470 and 2,500 meters. The discovery of both wrecks in the same search was significant in itself. The separation distance matched the German accounts. The timeline of events began to align. But none of that prepared anyone for what the ROV cameras actually showed when they reached Sydney. The damage was not the expected deterioration of a ship that had been underwater for nearly 7 decades. What the remotely operated vehicles documented was something far more violent. Over 80 shell holes were recorded in Sydney's hull, impact points from 5.9-inch rounds that had torn through steel from the outside in, and in some cases from the inside out as internal explosions followed. The structural damage was not limited to surface scarring. The bow section had completely detached from the main hull and was found at a separate location on the ocean floor, an indication of the catastrophic forces involved in the final sinking sequence. The bridge, the nerve center of the ship, the place where Captain Burnett would have been making decisions as the battle unfolded, was obliterated. Stop and hold that image for a moment. Think about what the analysts on that ROV team were looking at. A ship that was supposed to be powerful. A ship with a battle record. A ship whose crew had every reason to believe they were coming home. And on the ocean floor, after 67 years of silence, the cameras were showing twisted steel, collapsed sections, bow detachment, fire-melted structures, and lifeboat mechanisms that told their own terrible story. The lifeboats had not been successfully deployed. The evidence of fire was everywhere: aircraft structures, engine compartments, ammunition storage points. The sequence of destruction had been so rapid, so complete, that 645 men never had a realistic chance. The maritime experts watching the footage were not performing shock. They were experiencing it. If you've stayed with this story until now, you already sense that there is something more here than a ship at the bottom of the ocean. There are 645 separate human stories embedded in that wreckage. Think about that number, not as a statistic, as a count. The ROV footage forced historians and analysts to reassess how quickly Sydney had gone down. The shell impact patterns, the position of Sydney's own gun turrets at the time of sinking, the angle of the bow detachment, all of it pointed toward a far more rapid and violent end than some earlier theories had suggested. The ship did not limp for long. The internal fire propagation, fed by fuel and ordnance, combined with catastrophic structural damage from 87 incoming shells and torpedo impact, had effectively ended Sydney within minutes of the engagement reaching full intensity, at that range, at that speed of fire. There was no version of this story where the outcome changes. That forensic reality, confirmed by the wreck itself rather than by any second-hand account, is what silenced the experts. It was not just sadness. It was the weight of precision. The ocean floor had preserved the evidence. The cameras had read it. And what it said matched the most brutal possible interpretation of a point-blank ambush on an unsuspecting crew. One more detail has to be named, because it completes this story in a way that nothing else can. In 2021, 80 years after the sinking, HMAS testing confirmed the identity of the only recovered body from HMAS Sydney. His name was Thomas Ninnis Clark. His remains had washed ashore on Christmas Island years earlier, unidentified. It took modern forensic science, molecular analysis, and the passage of 8 decades to give one man his name back. One man out of 645. The wrecks of HMAS Sydney and Kormoran are now formally protected under Australian law as war graves. No artifacts are to be removed. The ocean floor at 2,500 meters is now a memorial, sealed and unreachable without extraordinary technology, preserving what remains of 645 lives and the ship that carried them. What does the wreck of HMAS Sydney actually tell us, now that we've seen it? It tells us that overconfidence in a proven asset can be the most dangerous variable in a military encounter. It tells us that tactical deception, a disguise, a false flag, concealed weapons at close range, can neutralize superior firepower in seconds. It tells us that 87 shells at 1,000 yards, combined with internal fires and torpedo damage, can bring down a decorated warship faster than any distress signal could travel. And it tells us that the ocean keeps what is given to it, sometimes for generations, until the technology finally exists to ask the right questions. If any part of this story changed the way you think about what happened on November 19, 1941, drop a comment below. Tell me what detail hit you hardest. Was it the 80 shell holes? The detached bow? Thomas Clark, identified after 80 years? The fact that 645 men left no survivors and no final word? This story deserves more than silence. It always has. The cameras reached Sydney in 2008. The footage was hard to watch. The experts went quiet. And somewhere at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, 12 nautical miles from the ship that destroyed her, HMAS Sydney still holds everything she was never allowed to say. The question that remains, the one that no ROV camera and no forensic scan has fully answered, is whether we have truly understood yet what those 645 men faced in their final minutes, or whether the wreck is still waiting for the technology that will finally let them speak.